Welcome to the Bioenergy and Natural Gas Supply presentation. My name is Robert Gibson and I am the Whole System and Gas Supply Manager at National Grid ESO. What I'm going to go through in this presentation is the bioenergy required across the four scenarios, as well as look at how the natural gas is supplied. As part of each of these topics, I will also cover the key insights and the key uncertainties, and then there will be time at the end for a question and answer session. So starting with bioenergy. Before I dive into detail, I wanted to give a bit of a definition of what I mean by bioenergy. We are defining bioenergy as being energy produced when we use organic feedstocks like energy crops, forestry and agricultural waste, and biological materials to produce energy. These feedstocks can be burned to produce heat or power, or processed to produce biogas or liquid biofuel. And with that, I'll move on to the key insights, which we will revisit at the end of each session, but this will allow you to keep them in mind as we go through the presentation. Firstly, the bioenergy has an important and potential role in decarbonising our energy system and wider economy when combined with CCS to deliver negative emissions. Secondly, a sustainable supply of feedstock for bioenergy is influenced by many factors, such as land use, waste management, and competing demand from non-energy sectors like agriculture and construction. And lastly, meeting the net zero target in our scenarios depends on negative emissions to balance residual emissions from other non-energy sectors. Bioenergy with CCUS can deliver this, but will rely on increased domestic production or imports from bioenergy feedstocks to achieve the scale needed. So looking at bioenergy across the four scenarios, looking at each of the scenarios in turn, going from bottom left to top right, starting with steady progression in the grey. This is our scenario where we do not meet the 2050 emissions target and is our low bioenergy supply scenario. Both system transformation in the blue and consumer transformation in the yellow are the two scenarios where we do reach net zero by 2050, and these are our medium supply scenarios with a large reliance on domestic supplies. Lastly, we have leading the way, where we reach 2050 emissions target early. This also has our highest demand for bioenergy. This scenario continues to have a requirement for domestic production, but also captures more of the imports market. Across the four scenarios, we have some assumptions that I want to highlight. In both our consumer transformation and system transformation, there's a strong policy support for development of domestic bioresources. In leading the way, this too has a strong reliance on domestic bioresources policy, but also has an assumption that there's a high availability of bioresources in an import market. Lastly, steady progression. In this scenario, unlike the other three green scenarios, there's no carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Therefore, our bioenergy cannot be combined with this to give negative emissions. The last assumption that I want to highlight is that there is a strong policy for production of green gas into the natural gas network to help it decarbonise. Looking at the demand for bioenergy across the scenarios out to 2050. The high, medium and low cases for the bioenergy were modelled as a limit, and the bioenergy used never exceeded this on the way out to 2050. These limits were derived from our Bridging the Gap work carried out last year and are influenced by many factors such as imports and availability to produce domestically. The limit for consumer transformation and system transformation was 220 terawatt hours, for leading the way 275, and in steady progression 180 terawatt hours. There is a drop in the bioenergy being used in the late 2020s across all the scenarios. This is due to the removal of the renewable obligation subsidy support that bioplants without CCUS would be taking advantage of. Shortly after this drop, you can see an increase in the demand for bioenergy. In the green scenarios, this is from bioplants with CCUS coming online and growing the demand. And in steady progression, the increase is largely due to growth in green gases. I want to now look at how bioenergy is used across the scenarios, with a focus on demand in 2050. When modelling the use of bioresources, we focused on three areas: meeting the end consumer demand where no alternative options of decarbonisation exist, BECCS for electricity generation to deliver negative emissions, and biomass gasification for hydrogen production with CCUS to also deliver negative emissions. If we first look at how these apply to consumer transformation, starting with the yellow of power generation, you can see that this takes up the lion's share of the available resources, and in fact 8% of electricity generated in 2050 is by bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Residential heat in blue represents homes that are hard to bring onto the networks and is present in all scenarios. Aviation in grey is the same across all scenarios and is to help decarbonise this sector. Industrial heat in the blue can be combined with CCUS, and in total, all bioenergy in this scenario gives us a negative emissions of 53 megatons of CO2 equivalent in the year 2050. Moving on to system transformation. Here, 9% of electricity is generated in the year 2050 from bioenergy with carbon capture, utilisation and storage. This is a higher percentage than consumer transformation, despite the lower use of bioresources in this sector. And this is due to the lower energy demand in this scenario. This scenario also has a larger negative emissions than consumer transformation at 55 megatons of CO2 equivalent. The increase in negative emissions is largely down to hydrogen production from biomass combined with CCUS. This is done through a process called biomass gasification and is a technology that uses controlled process involving heat, steam, and oxygen to convert biomass to hydrogen and other products without combustion. During this process, the carbon extracted from the biomass is captured and stored, resulting in negative emissions. The additional negative emissions are required to counter the residual emissions from hydrogen production from methane reformation with CCUS. In leading the way, we have our highest level bioenergy resource and the largest amount going to power. This results in 11% of all electricity generated being from BECCS, giving us a removal of 61 megatons of CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere. In this scenario, 31 terawatt-hours of bioresource is being used in shipping. This was to reduce the reliance on the shipping sector on hydrogen. This was possible due to the higher levels of bioresource available in this scenario. Lastly, we can take a look at steady progression. As I said earlier, there's no carbon capture in this scenario, and therefore no negative emissions coming from the use of bioenergy. However, there is still a level of decarbonisation happening, with green gas being blended into the natural gas network and making up a large chunk of the demand for bioresources in this scenario. This will be covered in more detail later in the gas supply section of this presentation. Revisiting the key insights. Firstly, bioenergy has an important role in the decarbonisation. This is largely seen with a range of sectors that can help decarbonise. When looking at the supply levels, we converted the range considered in FES and discussed the required feedstock to the UK across the scenarios. And finally, we've seen the potential negative emissions that bioenergy with CCUS can provide, helping us on our way to net zero. There are some key uncertainties to talk about for bioenergy. First of all, the optimal use for bioresources. We've gone for a mix here between the three scenarios, but with a large reliance on BECCS and power. But there is definitely some uncertainty on what the optimal utilisation of bioresources is. There was a range of supply scenarios included this year, however there is still uncertainty around this range and can it be pushed further, and we would love to hear your feedback. Moving on to natural gas supply section of this presentation. Here, the key insights for natural gas supply. Firstly, natural gas supply is polarised across the scenarios. This is due to having two high natural gas demand scenarios and two low natural gas demand scenarios. As we saw earlier, to meet net zero, bioresources are required in other sectors to get negative emissions, and this hampers the development of green gases in the scenarios. We will see that later without contribution from shale and green gas. Reliance on import increases, especially in the high demand scenarios. And lastly, shale gas is not present in any of our net zero scenarios. This is mainly due to the reduced support from government and consumers. Looking at the natural gas overview across the scenarios, again, we will start with steady progression in the bottom left and working my way to the top right. Steady progression has a high demand for natural gas. Its uses are very similar to that of today. System transformation also has a high demand, and this is largely from methane reformation, so turning natural gas into hydrogen. Consumer transformation is a low demand scenario with imports covering all of the demand by 2050, and that demand is largely required for methane reformation as well. Leading the way has an extremely low demand out to 2050, with all gas coming from the UK continental shelf in the later years. This is some key assumptions that we have made in these scenarios, and I'll start with consumer transformation. In the year 2050, imports remain available and flexible with all levels of natural gas demand. In system transformation, high levels of imports are available from the continent, despite the fact that hydrogen should be prominent across mainland Europe. We're expecting in this scenario through routes of natural gas from the likes of Russia through continental Europe into the UK. We're also presuming the LNG market remains strong even as the world turns to hydrogen. Leading the way, we're presuming gas from the UK is available to produce at all levels in the year 2050, extending the lifetimes of some fields to supply low levels of demand. Secondly, that the import infrastructure currently in the UK for natural gas starts to turn towards hydrogen. Lastly, in steady progression, we're making the presumption that shale is proven to be able to be produced safely, and that there's a high policy support for green gas. I'm going to go through the natural gas supply charts for each of the scenarios, starting with consumer transformation. I'm going to focus on the key points of each of these scenarios, as there's a lot of information on these charts. If you want to go through these in more detail, they are available in the data workbook as well as the document itself. Moving on to the chart. Firstly, looking at demand that we are meeting, you can see that this does drop to low volumes in 2050 due to the high levels of electrification in this scenario. The remaining demand is largely from methane reformation to produce hydrogen. In all of our scenarios, gas from the UK, as depicted in the light blue colour in this chart, is declining. However, this is the only scenario where production ceases completely, and this is in the year 2045. Green gas grows and then declines from 2030 onwards as bioresources are used elsewhere. This can be seen in the brown sliver in the chart. As gas from the UK declines and nothing comes in to replace it, reliance on imports grows to reach 100% from the year 2045. These imports are made up of Norwegian gas in the dark blue, gas coming from the continent in the pink, and liquefied gas in the yellow. The yellow and pink stripe is also imports, either coming from continent or LNG. But because the market is near impossible to predict far in advance, we have generic import category where the market will decide at the time. Moving on to system transformation. This is a high gas demand scenario with gas being required to produce hydrogen. Gas from the UK continues to produce in this scenario out to 2050, but as you can see, it does decline. Much like consumer transformation, green gas does grow slightly, but is displaced, in this case due to the increased use of hydrogen. Due to the reduction of UKCS, we can see the increase in import dependency. This reaches a maximum of 98% of all gas being imported by 2050. This imported gas is met by strong performance from Norway, as well as an increase in LNG imports. Leading the way has an extremely low gas demand with about 2 TWh left in the year 2050. Reduction in demand slows after 2045, and this because in this scenario, at this point, virtually all of the energy industry are decarbonised, and there's only some difficult to decarbonise areas left to meet after that. I said before in the assumptions that we've presumed that gas from the UK continental shelf can operate at low demand levels, as the import infrastructure for natural gas in the UK turns to hydrogen. The result in a 0% import reliance in the year 2050 for natural gas. However, there are imports from the year 2040 for hydrogen. Finally, steady progression. In this scenario, natural gas is being used in a similar way to that of today, resulting in high demands for gas. Again, UKCS is declining, however still producing by 2050. As stated before in the assumptions, we have presumed in this scenario that shale gas can be proven to be extracted safely. We therefore see a growth of shale gas from the early 2030s out to the year 2050. This is our scenario with the highest level of green gases, which is being produced domestically. As we saw before, this is a large proportion of the bioresources used in this scenario. With the growth in shale and green gases in this scenario, we do not reach the same heights of import reliance as some of the other scenarios, with imports topping out at around 70%. Now, revisiting the key insights for natural gas supply. Firstly, we discussed gas being polarised across the scenarios, with too high and too low gas demand scenarios. Levels of supply from green gas were lower than you may have expected, and we saw high levels of import dependency where there is no shale or green gas. Lastly, shale was not present in net zero scenarios due to the reduced support from government and consumers. Moving on to the uncertainties around natural gas supply. Firstly, shale. What does the future look like for shale, and does it fit with net zero, as it has the potential to have less emissions than that of the whole life cycle of LNG? Next is imports. With high gas demands and high import lines, this can raise questions around security of supply. Lastly, the economics of natural gas at low demand levels. We're seeing in two of our scenarios very low levels of natural gas being used, and at what point do the economics start to not make sense? As with everything in this presentation, but especially those uncertainties for both natural gas and bioenergy, we'd love to hear your feedback so we can feed it into the next iteration of future energy scenarios. Before I close, I'd like to briefly bring up the key insights again on the screen for both the bioenergy and natural gas supply, so you can be reminded of them. And with that, all that's left for me is to say thank you for listening to this presentation, and I will now hand over to the live question and answer session.